Howdy, neighbor. Good to have you here on Baden Hill with me again. And in this video, we'll be discussing the neighbor to the north for the United States. And this neighbor would be Canada, of course. And hopefully by now you're already a little bit familiar with Canadian geography and maybe even some Canadian history. It's my goal here to make sure that you have a little bit deeper understanding of how Canada became Canada and most importantly, its relationship to the United States. So let's start out with something unexpected. We're going to talk about French Canada. You might already know that French Canada is mainly concentrated in the province of Quebec. Yes, it's Quebec, not Quebec, as many Americans say. As I said for most of my life, certainly until college. Just after college, something happened in Quebec that really changed my thinking and understanding of Canada. And I'll come to that a little bit later in the video. Quebec is the name of the province that contains most of the French Canadian population in Canada. There are about 6 million French Canadians, and that's about a quarter of the population of Canada. And so it's very important that we understand that a sizable part of Canada feels itself connected to France, and that's very different from our understanding of our government, our constitution, our language that we speak in this country. And so pay attention to Quebec. Quebec is actually the largest Canadian province, and in land area, it's larger than any U.S. state, including Alaska. And so it's a significant land portion of Canada as well. For 200 years, French Canadians faced discrimination because they were different, because they spoke a language and maintained a tradition that was different from the English tradition that surrounded them. And some of this goes back to history on the continent of Europe, where England and France were cross-channel rivals. So the English Channel separates England and France, and as a result, because they were so close to each other, you can understand why they were rivals for centuries and even millennia, thousands of years. There's another reason. It's because they actually have so much in common. Now, today, you might not know that because French people in France, they really don't like English. They don't like speaking English. They know that it's kind of a global language, and they will because they learn it in school. But the British, for their part, they refuse to learn French, and there are a lot of jokes that go back and forth between England and France about the other side. And so some of that rivalry and the fact that they fought many wars over the course of the centuries, that spilled over into the New World, into the North American continent. And so for 200 years after the British basically took over Canada, the British, the English-speaking Canadians discriminated against the French-speaking Canadians. And again, part of the problem is it's not just language, it's also culture. And British people believed in economic progress and education and kind of keeping up with the times. But French Canadians were known to have a deep tradition, a love of their family and their community, a love of the land. That the culture that came from the French Canadians has a lot to do with, the fur traders, the trappers, the people who were out in the thick of the forest and kind of away from city life. And that continued even into the 20th century and maybe even today. You might even think of it as a characteristic of people there today. They also had a deep faith. They were Roman Catholics as opposed to the Protestants for in the British population. So even though they were all Christians, there was this conflict, and that again comes from the old world. Well, after Canada was taken over by the British, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, it became part of the British Commonwealth. And this continued even after it gained some sense of independence. It is independent today, but it's still part of this relationship, this network of former British colonies. And so that, again, it's called the British Commonwealth. And because it was a part of the British Commonwealth in the 1700s, 1800s, it was very much controlled by English culture and British culture. But finally, in 1969, so it took all the way until 1969, Canada accepted that it had two cultures and two languages. And Pierre Trudeau was the prime minister at that time, and he is obviously from French background, his last name Trudeau. And you need to know that the current prime minister of Canada is his son, Justin Trudeau. So the Trudeau family has been a very important part of Canadian history in the last 200, let me say the last 2 centuries, the 20th century and the 21st century. And finally, you just need to know that Quebec has changed, especially from 1950 on, from our readings about the Quiet Revolution. This wasn't violent at all times, although there were clashes and there were people who actually took up arms and fought to throw off this oppression that they saw. And from 1950 forward, you have this quiet revolution, and you have a separatist movement. And that separatist movement was a movement to be separate. It was an independence movement by people who wanted Canada to be on their own. In 1976, there was actually a referendum. That means they put the idea of independence to a vote, and 60% of people from Quebec, Quebecers they call them, chose to remain with Canada. There was another vote in 1994, which is again right after I finished college, and I remember that debate and the fact that it was very significant that Quebec might not be a part of Canada anymore, and we would have 2 neighbors to the north, and essentially we still do. But Quebec, by a very, very slim majority, chose to remain a part of Canada. And so that is the story, the brief, quick story of French Canada and Quebec, and we'll learn more about the cultural background of the country in the following segments. So, how did Canada become British? It all goes back to what was called the 7 Years' War in England and France. And so it's a war that started in Europe, and it spilled over into the New World, the colonies in North America. And the 7 Years' War ended with a British victory. And in the New World, it was called the French and Indian War. Remember that Indian was the term for centuries referring to Native Americans or Native Canadians, Native Alaskans, etc. And so, the 7 Years' War made all the difference, and it really was the turning point for Britain to have global power over the French, and that's when the British Empire really got going. But that wasn't the end of the story. You know that the Revolutionary War happened in our United States in 1776, and the war ended in 1783. And, this was a war that the Americans fought against the British, and so there were battles in Canada during the Revolutionary War. But the border was established, and Canada belonged to England at that time, and the United States was an independent nation. But some issues weren't resolved, and the British had this sense that they weren't just going to let go of the United States, and certainly they would continue to be the bigger brother, and they would show the United States who was in charge. And during the time of President Madison, this issue became very intense. I need you to know that, remember, Thomas Jefferson had purchased the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, and that was a huge factor in increasing the territory of the United States. But there's also the Northwest Territories, which were a part of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 to end the Revolutionary War. And the Northwest Territories are basically Ohio and Wisconsin and places like that along the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes are this boundary area between Canada and the United States. And so what you've got is some tension that came about because the British Navy was so powerful, and they started taking American ships and taking their soldiers as their own. Their sailors became British sailors once again. That policy was called impressment. And so the sailors on American ships that were captured by the British, they were forced to become British sailors. And this was happening even before the war started. And the United States didn't declare war immediately. They knew that they were weaker than England in many ways, especially their navy. But and also the problem was that the U.S. was not really excited about having another war, and so it was very unpopular. But just know, the long story made short is that the U.S. was able to, they first declared war on England, even though essentially the British had been declaring war because they took American sailors. But war was declared by the U.S. Interesting fact, the Mackinac Island, which is in northern Michigan, that was actually a battle, and the American soldiers there didn't get word that the U.S. had declared war on Britain, and the British troops there did get word, and so they attacked and they won a victory there. But one of the most important things is there were several battles where Americans were fighting Canadians. Americans wanted to take over what was called Upper Canada, which was just north of the Great Lakes, and also Nova Scotia, places like that. There were Americans who believed that expansion could happen by taking over some of this Canadian territory, which wasn't Canada's territory, it was British territory. And it's important to see then that it's true that the United States actually invaded Canada to try and take some of their territory. Well, the U.S. won the war, and one of the deciding victories was the Battle of New Orleans, which is very interesting. It's all the way on the other side of the continent, and Andrew Jackson gets credit for winning that battle. And as a result, the British, they lost influence in North America. Canada gained momentum for having more independence, and so on. That brings us to the status that has been the case for quite a long time. The relationship between the U.S. and Canada. It's been a close relationship, and there are close connections. In fact, most of the population of Canada lives within 100 miles of the U.S. border. So if you just extend the U.S. 100 miles up, you have most of the Canadian population, which shows that many Canadians, they get American TV stations and products, and they feel a closeness to the United States, but they also want independence, and they feel that they are able to criticize the United States when we do something wrong. But I think more importantly, they're a close ally of the United States. Through all of the great wars of the 20th century, it was the Canadians who supported American foreign policy. So even though Canada hasn't been a huge global force, they have been a huge force in supporting the United States when we needed their help. And the border between Canada and the United States is the longest open international border in the world. And that shows the trust that we have between our two countries. This trust was especially important for a kind of a small event in history, but in my lifetime it was a very big one. It was in 1979, and it was the Iran hostage crisis. It lasted for 444 days. And it was a case where there was a revolution in the country of Iran, Middle Eastern nation, next to Iraq. And Iran, there were students and religious leaders who overthrew the government. And we had an American embassy there, like we do all over the world and in most every country. And that embassy was taken over by students and militant leaders. And our workers in the embassy were taken hostage. At that time, and this is legendary because there was a movie called Argo, which was made about this experience. But the Canadian embassy actually took some of the workers who had managed to get out of the embassy, and they protected them, and they eventually created this amazing trick to get those people out of the country safely. They also were instrumental in just being a presence and communicating with the Iranian government, and eventually we were able to have our hostages released. But it was a terrible time for the country, and we were grateful for our neighbor to the north. Now, just a couple features that we need to mention. A couple features that we need to mention in Canada. We've already talked about Quebec. You need to know that Quebec City is an important city there, an older city. But there's also Montreal, which is a bigger city. It's not the biggest city in Canada. Toronto is the biggest city, and Vancouver is quite large as well and well known. So you have Montreal, which is an old city founded essentially by Champlain, who was that explorer who is kind of a father of Canada in many ways, along with Cartier. And Montreal is a city that they've actually hosted the Olympics. It's about 2 million people in Montreal and 4 million in the metropolitan area. So when you go expand the city a little bit. And it's very close to Pittsburgh in the United States, just across the border from Pittsburgh, essentially. And Toronto, the other city I mentioned, it's in the British part of Canada, or the English-speaking part of Canada, I should say. And Toronto's just across from Detroit. So you have this mirror. You have cities in Canada and cities across the usually rivers or boundaries of some kind, borders of some type. Vancouver's in British Columbia. Vancouver is a thriving city and a more and more diverse city. And Ottawa is the capital of Canada. It's a little more inland from Quebec City, and so just know that Ottawa was chosen by Queen Victoria to be the capital of Canada because Montreal was the capital initially, but there were kind of uprisings there, and there was tension between the English speakers and the French speakers. And so Ottawa was kind of a compromise and supposed to be in between the two areas of French and British. The St. Lawrence River is extremely important. It provides this artery that goes toward the Great Lakes, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence is a mouth that opens up into the Atlantic Ocean. And Hudson Bay, very important feature, named for Henry Hudson, but just a massive bay that you can say it connects a lot of Canada. And the Mackenzie River is the second largest river system after the Mississippi River, so in North America. And so the Mackenzie River system in Yukon Territory and mostly Northwest Territories is a very important river system to know. Now, we've studied the provinces, and so I'm just going to mention Nunavut. Nunavut is basically the native Canadian province, and I think it's 1999 that it officially became a province. And so Canada now has 10 provinces and 3 territories. Finally, Mount Logan. Mount Logan is the second highest peak after Denali. Denali is the new name for Mount McKinley. I grew up knowing it as Mount McKinley. There's some sense that because McKinley was one who wanted that manifest destiny and the expansionism of the U.S., that people in Alaska, especially the native Alaskans, they didn't really like the name McKinley, and so they chose a new name for it just recently, and the name is Denali. And so Mount Logan is very close to Denali and is kind of connected to Denali, and that is about a 19,500 foot mountain. Remember, Kilimanjaro and Kenya are 19,000 foot peaks in Africa. So 19,000 is a very high mountain, but remember, Mount Everest is 29,000. The features that are in the United States extend north. It's very important to know that the Rocky Mountains go all the way up from the United States, and they're also a part of Canada, and the same for the Great Plains. And so the same agriculture that exists in the Great Plains in the US exists in Canada as well. And so Canada is a major grain exporter. They export wheat and things like that. They also have many other agricultural products and for example, dairy farms and such. And it's important to know that because they're so similar to the United States, that there is a rivalry, and this has created trade difficulties, because if Canadian products are cheaper and they come into the United States, then U.S. farmers have a difficult time selling their products if it's more expensive for them to make their products or harvest their products or whatever it might be. It's important to talk about the Canadian Shield, which is this 8 million square kilometer area where the Hudson Bay is in the center, but it's basically this massive mineral deposit area, rich in nickel and copper, but also gold and silver. And so there are many mining areas. Sudbury in Ontario is maybe the most famous mining area, and it's very interesting because it's an exception to this shield of rock. It's like a valley, an indentation, and it was created by a meteorite. It was a meteor landing site, and so it smacked into the earth and created Sudbury's ability to get down into the Canadian Shield and mine. So that's an interesting bit of very, very ancient history. So there are these rich mineral deposits, and Canada benefits from that. We need to talk about the Grand Banks, and the Grand Banks is world-renowned. It's world-famous for its fishing industry. It is the richest fishing area in the world, and it has to do with the fact that it's very shallow. So it's off the coast of Newfoundland, which looks like Newfoundland. It's Newfoundland, and Newfoundland is the closest area. Off of Newfoundland, you have the Grand Banks, and it's a shallow area. It's a very large area, and it's shallow, and there are two currents that come together. One is the Labrador current. It's a very cold current, but then you also have the Gulf Stream, which is coming in, which is made famous by Finding Nemo, right? The Gulf Stream just is an incredibly swift, warm current going across the Atlantic Ocean and around the world. So those two currents coming together, along with the shallowness, it stirs up nutrients, and it creates a fantastic place for fish to thrive. So you have cod and swordfish, you have shellfish, lobsters, crabs, things like that. So it's a massive fishing industry, and as you might imagine, it's an amazing place for diverse seabirds. And so check with your resident bird expert and you'll find out all the species of birds that are in the Grand Banks area. And Grand Banks area is also famous because of the Titanic disaster. Titanic sank not too far from the Grand Banks, and so Grand Banks is used as a launching point for expeditions to try and find Titanic, but when it was found in 1985, now it's to go down to the site. It's basically a tourism industry now, although I don't know how many people actually go down there, but people have brought up artifacts, and that's been very controversial too. Should we let that site rest and the dead that are buried there, or should we try and get back treasures from the Titanic? Well, another thing you need to know about the Grand Banks is that it has been plagued by overfishing, and so it's critical that we learn about these geographical treasures and protect them, whether it's the Great Barrier Reef near Australia or the Grand Banks near Canada. We need to know that climate change or global warming is greatly affecting our world in these areas. So I hope that this helps, gives you some perspective along with your knowledge of provinces, and I hope that you will seek north and find out about our neighbor there, because they have supported us and we need to support them.